Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Today we're looking at the four nutriments, sattā āhāra, and the four wrong ways, sattā āgati. And these four nutriments and four wrong ways are really about understanding how we are sustained by nutriment, by āhāra. So this will be part one, which is an overview. We're not going to go into too much detail, but just enough to give you the overall picture of the four nutriments and going the four wrong ways. Let's begin with the Āhāra Sutta in Saṅgīti Sutta, chapter 12, discourse number 11. And we've come across this sutta in looking at the Saṅgīti Sutta in the ones. And the Buddha says, because there are these four kinds of nutriment for the maintenance of beings that have already come to be, and for the assistance of those about to come to be. What for? The physical or material nutriment, gross or subtle. Second, contact. Third, mental volition. Fourth, consciousness. These are the four kinds of nutriment for the maintenance of beings that have already come to be, and for the assistance of those about to come to be. Because these four kinds of nutriment have what as their source? What as their origin? From what are they born and produced? These four kinds of nutriment have craving as their source, craving as their origin. They are born and produced from craving. So the sutta goes on and talks about how craving is conditioned by feeling and all the way back through the paticcasamuppada. So what we have here is a list of four kinds of nutriments. So we know the first one is āhāraṭṭhitikā, physical nutriment. The second is āhāra, which is contact as nutriment. The third is āhāra, mental volition as nutriment. And the fourth is consciousness as nutriment, which is āhāra. And the Buddha says that the origin and source and that sort of thing about these nutriments is actually tanha, it's actually craving. And so you can see that due to craving the tanha towards these nutriments, we actually come to existence through clinging, and then through wanting to come to exist, we are born again, and therefore there is aging and death and the whole mass of suffering. So you can see that nutriment fits within the paticcasamuppada through our craving for these four different kinds of nutriment. So what's the question around why we need to know more about these nutriments is really that we need to understand what are these things that we crave that enable us through our intentions, through our volition, through our underlying tendencies to actually keep coming back into samsara. The sutta that's really useful when it comes to understanding the four nutriments, the sattā āhāra, is actually the Puttamansa Sutta. So that's again Saṅgīti Sutta, chapter 12, discourse number 63. And in this sutta, the Buddha gives four different similes for the four nutriments. So the first one, āhāra, the physical nutriment, the Buddha gives the simile of the sun's flesh. For contact as nutriment, āhāra, the Buddha gives a simile about the flayed cow. And for āhāra, the mental volition as nutriment, the Buddha gives the simile of the man dragged to a charcoal pit by two strong men. And then lastly, āhāra, consciousness as nutriment, the Buddha gives the simile of criminal being punished by the king. So we won't go into detail here, but what's really important is to take into your mind the Dhamma in terms of these similes, because when you reflect on each of the four nutriments using these particular similes, it's very powerful. It's very penetrative and quick to actually understand and to remember. Actually, if you're trying to remember the four nutriments, it's good to remember these particular similes and then to deliberate, contemplate, examine what does the Buddha actually mean and why does he use these particular similes. And he used them for a particular reason. And as we know from the first example being the sun's flesh, the first simile of physical nutriment, it's a very powerful simile and one that we find quite hard to take into our minds. But once we do, we actually understand the physical nutriment a whole lot better. If we understand about the four nutriments and how we cling to the four nutriments, then we understand that it is on the unprofitable side, that it will activate craving, and therefore when it activates craving, it activates upādāna, the clinging. If it activates clinging, then what happens is you start to want to come to exist, bhava. And if that happens, then you trigger jati, birth or rebirth, and therefore you're subject to aging and death, and then the whole mass of suffering. So it's really important to understand that we go the wrong way when we crave these four nutriments. And so when you go to the Pitaka disclosure or Petaka Upadesa, the last chapter gives us 4 unprofitable directions coming out of these 4 nutriments. So you begin with the 4 nutriments, āhāra. It leads to perversions, vipallāsa. And it gives you almost like this process map of how it escalates. So it goes to the 4 clingings, upādāna, 4 bonds, yoga, 4 body ties, kayaganta, 4 taints, asava, 4 floods, olga, 4 darts or barbs, salla, and then the 4 steadying points for consciousness, viññāna-titti, and then the 4 going the wrong way, which is āgati gamanam. So you can see that there's an insight pathway or knowledge pathway that leads, beginning with the 4 nutriments, the āhāras, and it slowly through the perversions or the corruptions of the mind keeps you from abandoning these things. Instead you cling. When you cling, then you get bonded. When you get bonded, then you are tied. Then when you're tied or knotted, it activates the taints, and then the taints then activate the floods, and then the darts, which have the poison, and then you're establishing, because consciousness is steadying in 4 different things, your consciousness there, and therefore you're basically stuck, and therefore you go one of the 4 wrong ways, or even all the 4 wrong ways. So this is very important Dhamma. This is what we learn from sattā āhāra and these 4 nutriments, and this whole unprofitable side is how we actually construct over and over again this body and this mind. And when we know this, it becomes something very useful in moving forward in our Dhamma practice. Now, Buddha does give the antidote to this, and the mirror antidote to this is really the 4 different directions on the profitable side, and we know this as the patipadas, the different pathways. And so we know that there are the dukkha patipadas and the sukha patipadas. So these are the painful ways and the pleasant ways. And we know that there are 2 different realizations. There's the quick realization and the slow realization. So slow realization is danda biñña, and quick realization is kipa biñña. So then we have dukkha patipada, danda biñña, dukkha patipada, kipa biñña. Painful way with slow and quick realization. And then we have sukha patipada, danda biñña, sukha patipada, kipa biñña. So pleasant way with slow and quick realization. And if you remember, in the suttas, Venerable Mahamoggallana, he realized the truth, realized full awakening through dukkha patipada, kipa biñña, so painful way with quick realization. And Venerable Sariputta was pleasant way with quick realization, so sukha patipada, kipa biñña. And so in that way, when we look at these 4 unprofitable directions, we can see eventually, when we look at the diagram or the table, that Venerable Mahamoggallana overcame pasahara, so the contact as nutriment was very clear for him. And for Venerable Sariputta, it was the viññāna-āhāra, consciousness as nutriment. And of course, they understood all these 4 nutriments, but it's interesting to see which pathway they actually completed through. What can be really daunting about looking at sattā āhāra, or these 4 nutriments, is really around the Pali terms and the meanings of these Pali terms. So it's a good idea to start with familiarizing ourselves with some of the Pali terms and their meanings, and what the suttas actually say about them. As we've already at the beginning looked at what are the four nutriments, we can now look at the question of what are the four perversions, vipallāsa. So in the Vipallāsa Sutta in Saṅgīti Sutta, chapter 4, discourse number 49, the Buddha says, mendicants, there are these four perversions of perception, mind, and view. What for? Taking impermanent as permanent. So we take it as nicca instead of anicca. The second is taking painful as pleasurable. So we take it as sukha instead of dukkha. And then taking not me and mine, or also known as not self, as me and mine, self. So we take atta instead of anatta. And then the last one is taking unattractive as attractive. So we take this as subba. So these are the four perversions of perception, mind, and view. So the reason why Buddha says perversions of perception, mind, and view is because these four are multiplied by 3. So initially we have these wrong perceptions. Once they're firmly established, we take them into our mind, and so our thoughts are imbued with subba, sukha, atta, nicca. And when that happens, then we develop a very strong view towards it. So we really see it as permanent, really see it as pleasurable, really see it as me and mine, and really see it as attractive. So that's how the 4 perversions become 12. Then we ask the question, what are the 4 kinds of clinging, upādāna? And the Buddha says in the Upādāna Sutta, in Saṅgīti Sutta, chapter 45, discourse number 173, mendicants, there are these 4 kinds of clinging. What for? Clinging to sensual desires, so this is kāma upādāna. Clinging to views, ditthi upādāna. And then clinging to virtue and observances, silabbata upādāna. And then you have the last one, which is clinging to a theory of me and mine, or clinging to a theory of self, which is attavada upādāna. So then the Buddha goes on to say, these are the 4 kinds of clinging. This noble eightfold path is to be developed for direct knowledge of these 4 kinds of clinging, for the full understanding of them, for their utter destruction, for their abandoning. And then we ask, what are the 4 kinds of bonds? Yoga. And the Buddha says in the Yoga Sutta, in Saṅgīti Sutta, chapter 45, discourse number 172, mendicants, there are these 4 bonds. What for? The bond of sensual desires, Karma Yoga. Then you have the bond of existence, Bhava Yoga. Then you have the bond of views, Ditthi Yoga. And then you have the bond of ignorance, Avijja Yoga. And then the Buddha says these are the 4 bonds. This noble eightfold path is to be developed for direct knowledge of these 4 bonds, for the full understanding of them, for their utter destruction, for their abandoning. And then we ask, what are the 4 body ties, Kaya Ganthas? And the Buddha says in the Gantha Sutta in Saṅgīti Sutta, chapter 45, discourse number 174, Buddha says, mendicants, there are these 4 body ties or knots. What for? The body tie of covetousness, abhijja kaya gantha. The second is the body tie of ill will, vyapada kaya gantha. And then the third is the body tie of misapprehension, paramasa kaya gantha. And then the fourth is body tie of insistence that this is the truth. And this is idam sacca binivesa kaya gantha. These are the 4 body ties. This noble eightfold path is to be developed for direct knowledge of these 4 body ties, for the full understanding of them, and for their utter destruction, for their abandoning. So the thing to say at this point is, as we go through, you can see the escalation of our attachment. That we started off with these nutriments, then there's the perversion in the mind, the corruption, and then what happens is we start to cling. When we start to cling, we then get bonded, so it's, we start to attach. And then by the time we get to the body ties, we're getting really sunk in. We're knotted to these wrong ideas, these wrong things. And so the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddha keeps emphasizing, is this is how we actually get out of it, how we start to see and to understand we don't want to do this. And so when you look at sattā, āhāraṭṭhitikā, these 4 nutriments, you see how we crave and then we start to get bonded in all these different ways. So that's the easiest way of understanding it, that we're starting to attach and then it deepens. And then by the time we get to the end, there's no choice. We're already so deeply embedded and bonded and attached that to whatever it is that's driving, and we'll see this in the actual chart itself, that it's quite a hopeless case, and we need to understand that the reason why we learn it is because we want to understand how do we undo this. So then we ask, what are the four taints, asava? And if we go to the Patisambhida Magga, it lists out the four for us. And it says, understanding of the cutting off of taints due to purity of non-distraction is knowledge of concentration with immediate result. What are these taints? They are the taint of sensual desires, so this is kama asava. Then you have the taint of existence, bhava asava. Then you have the taint of views, ditta asava. And then you have the taint of ignorance, avijja asava. And as we know, in this process towards realization, towards nibbana, the taints and how we uproot them is really the final part to this. But they're really, really the deepest defilements that we have. And so these are the four that we'll be looking at as part of these four nutriments. Then we ask the question, what are the four floods, Orga? So the Buddha says in the Orga Sutta, which is Saṅgīti Sutta, chapter 45, discourse number 171, mendicants, there are these four floods. What four? The flood of sensual desires, kama orga, the flood of existence, bhava orga, the flood of views, ditti orga, and the flood of ignorance, avijja orga. These are the four floods. This Noble Eightfold Path is to be developed for direct knowledge of these four floods, for the full understanding of them, for their utter destruction, for their abandoning. So with the floods, you can already see we've got so far down the line that we're almost drowning in sensual desire, in existence, in views, in ignorance. So this is quite a dire situation by the time that you're in the four floods. So now we ask, what are the four darts, salla? And in the Sutta Nipata, there are two suttas that actually talk about darts, and in the, I think the commentary to it, which is the Mahanidesa, or could be the Chula Nidesa, either one, it talks about 7 darts. But for the purposes of looking at the four nutriments, we don't need to know the 7 darts, we just need to know the 4. And so we go to the Pethakopadesa and the final chapter, and it says that there are 4 darts, and the first one is the dart of lust, which is raga salla. The second is the dart of hate, which is dosa salla. The third is the dart of views, which is ditti salla. And the final one is the dart of delusion, which is moha salla. So salla can be translated as dart or barb, but if you use the term dart, then usually a dart is coated with something like poison. And so the poisons that have embedded into us at this point is lust, hate, views, and delusion. So this is what is helping us to go the wrong way. Now we ask, what are the steadying points for consciousness, vijnana titi? And if we go to the same last chapter of Pethakopadesa, it says, consciousness gripped by the 4 darts is steadied on 4 ideas. On form, so this is rupa, on feelings, vedana, on perception, sanya, on volitional formation, sankhara. These are the 4 steadying points for consciousness. So then you get form as the steadying point for consciousness establishing. You get feeling as steadying point for consciousness establishing. You get perception as steadying point for consciousness establishing. And you get volitional formations as steadying point for consciousness establishing. So really when you look at this, you start to understand that these aggregates are very important to see through, to see that they are unlasting, to see that they are not what you think they are, that they are the source of great dukkha when you cling to them, and it's not worth taking as me and mine, particularly when you see the change in them. That's what we usually meditate on in the Silavant Sutta, in the Samadhi Bhavana Sutta, in all these different suttas that look at the 5 aggregates correctly. Because otherwise, when we don't see them correctly, vijnana, consciousness, wants to go and establish itself there. That's how it gets its food. And so this is what this is really telling us about. It gets to establish in these wrong places. And so it propels us into future rebirths. Finally, we come to the question of what are the four goings the wrong way, āhāraṭṭhitikā gamanang. And the Buddha says in the Saṅgīti Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 4, discourse number 17, mendicants, there are these four goings the wrong way. What for? One goes a wrong way because of desire, so this is chanda āhāraṭṭhi. One goes a wrong way because of hatred, which is dosa āhāraṭṭhi. The third is one goes a wrong way because of delusion, so this is moha āhāraṭṭhi. And then one goes a wrong way because of fear, bhaya āhāraṭṭhi. These are the four goings the wrong way. If through desire, hate, fear, or delusion, one transgresses against the Dhamma, one's fame diminishes like the moon in a dark fortnight. So this is basically the unprofitable direction. We end up going the bad way through desire, hate, delusion, and fear. So it's quite dire for us when this happens. And so this is what we're training on the Noble Eightfold Path not to do. And the reason why Buddha wants us to see this is because when we know how something is constructed, then it makes sense how we not construct it. So this is very important in terms of this Dhamma that we want to take into our mind. Knowing how we have done it, the samudaya of it, the arising of it, and then we want to learn what is the atangama of it, the passing away of it, which will be the patipadas when we get to that. A very good way of understanding what the Buddha is showing us in modern terms is to see it as process maps. So this is Buddha's process map for how we go the wrong ways through craving the nutriments. And by process mapping, he's showing how when we take something in the wrong way, it escalates. And for us, the bigger predicament is that if we keep going down these wrong ways, we keep training in these wrong ways every day, then when it comes to the breakup of the body upon our passing, then it's only natural that if we follow what we've been practicing in daily life, we will construct another birth. So by understanding it, we actually start to notice how we actually end up in these four wrong ways all the time. So if on a daily basis you're abiding with fear, then you can see how you get there. Same with hate, same with desire, and same of course with delusion, which is always the harder one to see. But it gives a very useful framework and process map for understanding what the Buddha is teaching us and the reason for what he's teaching us. And therefore when we come to the four patipadas, the four pathways, then we'll understand what it's actually serving as the medicine towards. And so if you take it into your mind in that way, that you see this is the framework, this is the process map that Buddha's giving us, then we can actually unlock it. Because what we want to do is unlock how we keep abiding in these wrong places. We keep going down these wrong ways. And so once we see that, it's very, very useful. This is the chart which gives the process maps for the four different unprofitable directions. So we've already had an overview of each of the different terms or elements that comprise going the bad way or going the wrong way in these four different directions based on the nutriments. And so this particular map or chart is given in the Pethakopadesa, the Pitaka disclosure. It actually outlines what fits under what and what produces what. So the first thing to really take into your mind when you look at this chart is really to understand the different rows. So the first row under the heading is about all the nutriments. That's where they're placed. So the first direction is the physical nutriment, the second direction is the contact as nutriment, the third is the mental volition as nutriment, and the fourth direction is consciousness as nutriment. And if you look at the last row, you go the bad way or the wrong way through desire, through physical nutriment. You go the wrong way through hate, through contact as nutriment. That's the second direction. The third direction is you go the wrong way through fear, which is mental volition as nutriment. And then when you take consciousness as nutriment, you go the wrong way through delusion. So that's how it's set out. And in between those first and second rows is you get the perversions, then you get the clinging, the upādāna, you get the bonds, the yoga, then after that you get the body ties, the kaya ganthas, then after that you get the taints, which is the asavas, then the floods, which is the augas, then you have the darts, which is the salas, which is sometimes also known as barbs, and then you get the setting points for consciousness, which is the vijnana sthiti. So there's an escalation. When you look at the arrow going down, what you'll eventually be able to meditate on is each of the directions going downwards. And you'll be able to take into your mind how it escalates, how when you take the wrong things out of craving for the physical nutriment and things get deeply embedded, what happens is you go these wrong ways. So we're not going to go into too much detail here, but on the next slide we're going to do a simplified version, because I think it's very important to take into your mind at least the gist of what the Buddha is saying by these 4 different unprofitable directions. I'm going to simplify this table for you. But essentially what you do want to do is to learn this table, because once you learn this table, you know how you constructed each existence. And what you do come to understand is that we can abide in these wrong places, in these wrong ways, even now in everyday life. So if you ask yourself the question, do I go the wrong way through desire? Do I go the wrong way through hate? Do I go the wrong way through fear? And do I go the wrong way through delusion? The answer for all of us is yes. And when the answer is yes at different times, each of these things get activated, then what you want to do is train yourself out of it. And the only way you can want to do that is to understand how we get to these wrong ways. Because these wrong ways is where we really sit at the moment. So a lot of people are quite obviously at the moment sitting in hate and sitting in fear. So when you watch the news, when you see what's going on around the world, you really start going the wrong way through hate and fear. And it doesn't mean that desire and delusion don't exist. They all do as well. But more obviously, you can see a lot of people abiding with a lot of fear. And then out of frustration, you can see a lot of people abiding with hate at politicians, at the status of people's freedoms and liberties, out of views, out of all kinds of things. And so when you start to see that, then you really want to get out of it. And when you want to get out of it, then you want to know, what are the patipadas, what are the different dhammas that the Buddha teaches in order to walk the Noble Eightfold Path, in order to gain the wings of awakening, to not construct another existence, not to birth again, not to experience aging and death and the whole mass of suffering again. And so this sattā āhāra, these 4 nutriments, and these 4 āgati-gamanang, the 4 wrong ways that we go, very, very important to wake us up to actually see how these things happen. So let's look at this simplified version. So I've created this just for learning purposes. The full chart is actually the true Dhamma. It's the one that really needs to be meditated on and learnt. Like when we talk about Buddha's learning is not just learning the terms and hearing them. It's also contemplating them in our minds. It's saying them out loud. It's writing them down. It's also discussing them with other people in order to really get them embedded into our mind, to ensure we understand and to question each other around them. And then also to meditate on them, because it's in meditation that you see the insight pathway. Wisdom comes from that, and you really take that deeply into your mind and into your heart, and then everything starts to make sense, and from that wisdom grows. You start to sharpen your faculties. So these things that the Buddha instructs us on is really also about sharpening our faculties, sharpening what we understand of certain things. So when we look at this, what I've done is I've just taken some key things from the original table and simplified it, sort of like shortened it, so it's easy for us to take on board, because under each of the nutriments there's certain things that are driving it, and that's the thing that we want to take away from this overview. And underneath the table what I've put is the similes that the Buddha's given, because you can take that into your mind as well. So the first thing is the physical nutriment. Let's start with the physical nutriment. So the physical nutriment is driven by subba, is driven by what we take as attractive or fair. And instead of taking asubba, which is the unattractive or the foul. So when we take the physical nutriment, it can be gross and subtle, but in our case, in the human realm, it's other people's bodies. It's also food, like physical food. So when we take that in the wrong way and we take it as attractive or we take it as pleasing, then we can misapprehend. And then what happens is all the kinds of attachments. And what's driving it is sensual desire or sensual pleasure, that we take it very much through the sensual lens. And by that, it means all the things that we talked about, clinging, bonds, knots or kaya gantas, which is the body ties. The taints get activated, we get flooded, then we have the poison from the dart. And then what happens after we get this attachment, very much through sensuality, consciousness, vijnana, steadies on form. We keep going back to the form, so we keep going back to the food, we keep going back to the body, and then we go the wrong way through desire. So the Buddha's simile for this is the sun's flesh. So the sun's flesh is a very powerful simile that the Buddha gives, and very difficult one for us to contemplate. But once you pierce through that block that stops you from thinking about it, like eating one's own child's flesh, then you really see that the physical nutriment is only about nourishment. It's not for fun, it's not for bulking up, it's not for decoration or beautification, not for any of those things. It's only for nourishment. So when we look at food, physical food, things that we eat, when we look at other people's bodies, Buddha is saying, don't look at it for decoration, don't look at it for bulking up, don't look at it for seeing it as attractive. Instead, see it for what it is, only for nourishment. Because otherwise, you'll attach through sensual desire, which is the wrong lens to look through. And therefore, if you don't do that, then consciousness won't steady on those forms. Every time it contacts, it will keep misapprehending. So when you get to this wrong way due to desire, what happens is, if you're coming from the perspective of sensual desire, then you're not seeing the truth. You're actually wanting to come back for these things. Now, the wholesome side to desire, chanda agati, is the wrong way, but the wholesome way is when you have chanda towards nibbana. So this thing is very important. If you're wise and you see through the physical nutriment, kabbalinkara āhāra, if you see through that, then your desire is not for the physical nutriment, your desire is for nibbana. You hold nibbana as the highest, as the thing that is the most wholesome and profitable. Otherwise, out of subba, this subba vipallāsa, this corruption of the mind that takes it as attractive, driven by lots of sensual desire, always going back to the form, then you would come back to an existence out of desire. Instead, the Buddha is saying, see nibbana as the thing that you truly desire above all these other things. So then you come to contact as nutriment. What is this driven by? This is driven by sukha feelings. So seeing things as pleasurable instead of painful. So you keep going for sukha. So sukha, what drives that, once you always take sukha, is you always want to come to exist for that sukha. So you get the clinging, the bondage, the body ties, the taints, the floods, and the dart. All that is attaching. Because of sukha, you want to come to exist. That's what's being driven. And therefore, consciousness keeps steadying on feeling, because sukha vedana, pleasurable feelings. And so you go the wrong way through hate. And so the Buddha gives the flayed cow as the simile here. So the flayed cow means the cow has a lot of wounds. So in any direction that the cow is just standing there, the wind comes and you get afflicted. It's painful. It's not pleasurable, it's painful. If water gets thrown on the cow, again, it's painful, these open wounds. And if the heat of the sun, again, those wounds get afflicted again. And so this is the simile that one contemplates when it comes to contact as nutriment. Rather than seeing sukha or experiencing sukha What one really experiences is the dukkha. And so unless you see that and you keep going and get driven by sukha feelings, then you keep getting driven by existence, wanting to come to exist, to create another birth, and therefore you're bound for the wrong way due to hate. So then the third nutriment is mental volition as nutriment. So this is really driven by the corruption that says there is a self, it's me and mine, instead of not me and mine. And what this is really driven by is wrong views. So all those meditations where we were looking at the Silavanta Sutta, Samadhi Bhavana Sutta, things associated with Paticca Samuppada, the dependent origination, when we're looking at Yoniso Manasikara, when we take certain things as me and mine, these aggregates, then we develop the wrong view because we don't see it in the right way. And so what we're attaching to is all these wrong views. So there is the clinging to the wrong views, the bonding to the wrong views, the body tie of wrong views, the misapprehension of the wrong view. Rather than seeing it in the truth, you see it in the wrong way, you misapprehend, and therefore you're flooded all the time with these wrong views. And it leads to the poison always activating within you. And therefore consciousness keeps steadying on this perception, wrong perception, sick perceptions. It's worth taking as me and mine. So you end up in fear. So you see that a lot right now, like both the hate and the fear with this current global situation. When you really cling to oneself as me and mine, and to your loved ones as me and mine, particularly those loved ones are mine, then the wrong view is that you don't remember we are of the nature to sicken, we are of the nature to die. And so as this whole global situation keeps unfolding, what keeps pressing on us is we don't want to lose them, we don't want anyone to get sick, we don't want to get sick, and we keep fearing, sickness, we keep fearing whatever sickness is going around right now, the different strains of it, and we keep clamoring for different kinds of traditional and modern medicine for it, not realizing that even temporarily it will help in some cases. In some cases it won't help. But when we have this misapprehension out of these wrong views about me and mine, then we clamor around out of fear, and we keep perceiving things in the wrong way, and therefore we forget we are of the nature to sicken, we are of the nature to eventually pass away. And so that's what we forget. So mental volition as nutriment is driving that. And same with the hatred. When we want to have our liberties back, when we want to be free, to indulge, to have sukha feelings, then of course, when we're not getting those feelings, we go the wrong way with hate. So that's an example of looking at those two things. Now, with mental volition as nutriment, the simile that the Buddha gives is this man being, or this person being dragged by two strong people to the charcoal pit. And so we're fearful of going into the charcoal pit. And so our volition is not to be taken to the charcoal pit. And what we want is not to be taken. And so that's the simile that the Buddha asks us to contemplate. That when we're fearful, this is the simile to use, and to see how we actually construct going the wrong way due to fear. And then the final one is consciousness as nutriment, vijnana āhāra. What drives this is always seeing nicca, permanency. We see permanency where there is impermanency. So permanent instead of impermanent, nicca instead of anicca. So with this, what happens is when we take this in the wrong way, always seeing lastingness, then we get attached out of ignorance. Everything that is driving it is ignorance. Ignorance, we're bonded to ignorance, we're body tied to ignorance, we have the clinging to ignorance, we have the taint of ignorance, and so on and so forth, until we get to the point of delusion. And so what consciousness is really steadying on at this point is the volitional formations, the choices, the stories, the ideas that there is lastingness, that we keep thinking and believing that. But the truth is that when you take the Buddha Dhamma correctly, there is old age, there is sickness, there is death. So when you see that change, when you see that this body doesn't last, how can that be true? But when consciousness is the nutriment and we have this perversion that there is permanency, then of course we go straight to delusion. That when we're imbued with volitional formations that are false, then of course we go the wrong way due to delusion. And so the Buddha gives the simile of the criminal being punished by the king with 100 hits with the spear or the stick, 100 times in the morning, 100 times in the afternoon, 100 times in the evening. So 300 lashings throughout the day. This is like what vijnana, when it is going down the wrong way, what it is like. We are constantly being hit with wrong volitional formations that keep saying there's permanency where there isn't. So that's how we meditate on it. So that's how you see the larger picture, that through all the different terms that the Buddha gives, which has more precision, that this is how we go these 4 wrong ways from these 4 nutriments. So this is very helpful when we start to understand what the Buddha means. So I'll end the session here. This gives you the overview of the 4 nutriments and the 4 wrong ways. And in upcoming things, we'll look at the Puttamansa Sutta in a little bit more detail, and we'll also go through each of the nutriments in more detail. So we can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem, wishing you all well. Teruan Saranai.